What is your name, what are your pronouns, and what are you going to talk about today?
My name is Huey Arslan. I'm he, him. Today I'm just going to talk about my experience with being dyslexic.
Could you give us a Dyslexia 101?
Dyslexia is a way your mind works, sort of how you approach problems, how you see certain things. It can impact things like spelling, reading, writing, problem solving, and time management and things like that as well.
Could you please give us a brief description of what being dyslexic means to you personally?
For me, my dyslexia has always been associated with my spelling, especially when I was growing up, and sort of reading and writing. So those are the sort of main areas where what dyslexia means to me.
How did dyslexia affect you growing up?
I think it was around year 5, I started to realise that I was a bit behind in English, reading and writing. I didn't enjoy reading as a kid. I still don't enjoy reading just because it takes me a lot longer. So that was something that as a child I was very conscious of. And then when I got into junior school, so sort of, year 4, 5, 6, I started taking extra classes outside of class to help with reading and writing, especially my handwriting was very, very poor back then. It's still not great, but I tend to use a keyboard nowadays. But yeah, I wasn't formally diagnosed at all. I got to secondary school and it was sort of just understood that I had dyslexia, but I still didn't have a diagnosis. So I didn't really get any support through secondary school. And then when it came time to do GCSEs, they were like, you need to get a formal diagnosis. Otherwise you won't have your extra time and things in exams. And that was quite stressful just because it's not cheap. It was something like £600 to be diagnosed privately because I think the NHS waiting list was very long, or either that or they didn't offer it. So yeah, I had to be diagnosed privately, and then managed to get extra time for my exams, and that sort of carried through my GCSEs and my A-levels, and that was very, very helpful. I think I did quite well in my GCSEs, mostly because I was able to spend a little bit more time on some of the written exams, which was really, really helpful. And then sort of similarly throughout A-levels, although I didn't really get much support, it was really helpful to have the extra time.
Have you felt you've been marginalised or stereotyped due to being dyslexic?
It's not necessarily the worst of stereotypes or marginalisations, but there are definitely people don't ask me how to spell things, for example, and I don't blame them, to be honest, but people ask if they want them to check over my work before I submit it, things like that. People do point out grammatical spelling errors a lot. I think in classrooms, when you're set reading assignments and things and you're asked to do reading, I don't think a lot of thought is had for people in the room who are dyslexic, because it honestly does take me 2 to 3 times as long to read things as a lot of people. And even sometimes when I've read it, it's sort of, I'm reading the words, but I'm not really processing the words. So I think there is a bit of marginalisation there around the speed of teaching, things not being paused, not giving enough time to read. I think everyone's been in that situation where they're trying to read a slide and the lecturer changes it. When you're dyslexic, that's sort of every single time, for me at least. So yeah, I think there's subtle ways, and I don't think I've ever had anything that's particularly sort of nasty or deliberate, but it's sort of subtle, unconscious things like that that can make you feel a bit marginalised.
Has anything like this happened at the university, or have you felt quite accepted?
I think generally, I feel accepted. I don't think anyone would ever say I can't do this, can't do that because I'm dyslexic here. I think when I came to Hull, I was sort of got in contact with the SPLD team and said, I'm dyslexic, but my assessment is pre-16, so I know I have to do another one. How do I do that? Can I be helped? And it was really, really good. They had me booked in to do a completely free assessment within 2 weeks of being here. And that was really helpful because it meant I could apply for my disabled student allowance funding for a laptop. So I feel like we are very, the university is very accepting of dyslexia, the extra time and things in place, although accessing that extra time is not always easy. For exams, it's easy because it's pre-applied. For assignments, it's not always easy because you sort of have to go through a process of applying for an extension, even though it sort of should be pre-applied to people who are entitled to it. And I'm not sure if that's changed since I was studying, because I know I've raised it a few times with people. No, other than that, I don't think I've ever been sort of marginalised at university. Lectures. When I first came to Hull, I was studying physics, and it's very fast-paced, and that was pre-pandemic as well. So a lot of things weren't recorded, so that could be difficult. Going through slides very quickly, not necessarily getting the chance to note everything down, especially because the reading speed is slow, but also the writing speed is slower. So it's just sort of multifaceted, and so that could be difficult sometimes. But I think especially sort of post-pandemic and sort of during the pandemic, when I was sort of doing my first, second and third year, having the recorded stuff was so much more helpful, because you could pause it and you could take things in and then play it and then rewind it, and it was really, really helpful.
What has your experience been like as a staff member at the university?
it's fully accepted, it's fully understood. There are sometimes workloads and deadlines that you have to get to. I mean, for example, sometimes papers for meetings are sent quite late, and these papers can be sometimes hundreds of pages. So I have to put aside a lot of my own time sometimes to read these papers outside of work, which I know that quite a lot of colleagues at the university end up doing. And that's obviously not necessarily 100% healthy, people to be taking work home like that. But I think in general, there's a clear understanding that if I say I need a bit of extra time to get a piece of work done because of dyslexia, that will be understood and accepted. But I do think I'd have to make that conscious action of saying, I need the extra time. Because, people forget as well. Like dyslexia is one of those things you don't necessarily always look at someone and think, remember, they've got dyslexia. It's not something that's visible. So I think in general it's accepted. The culture is accepting of dyslexia, and I think it being a university, a lot of people understand more what dyslexia is. I think outside of sort of the academic space, people have less of an understanding. They say dyslexia, you just think, you can't read or you can't spell. But it's obviously a lot more multifaceted than that. So I think there is a deeper understanding of what dyslexia is here than in other places I've been, schools, for example. So that is really encouraging and helpful.
How could the people around you and the university do better?
In terms of people around, it's when you're working together on work, it can sometimes be frustrating for people who are working with me if they're waiting on me to read something or waiting on me to write something, or if they have to go through something I've written because it's got numerous grammatical and spelling mistakes. So I think just being a bit patient with people in that respect could be an improvement. And I'm not saying people don't do that. I'm just saying that, that's the sort of thing you continuously do and improve on. In terms of the university, I think it's just every day making sure that the culture at the institution is geared in the right direction. It's, understanding of specific learning difficulties, not just dyslexia, but dyspraxia, ADHD, other things like that. So I think there might need to be some thought put into when you're sending long documents to people to read, whether there is some sort of mitigation in place for people who have dyslexia. Do you send it earlier, or do you give them a bit extra time, or do you hold 30 minutes before the meeting so that they can actually read it rather than having to read it at home and things like that? So I think it's the sort of thing that people don't really think about, but can be quite distressing for people with dyslexia when they're up till gone midnight trying to read papers and other people have finished them by 9 o'clock.
Would you want to do some myth busting about stereotypes surrounding dyslexia?
Myth number 1. Dyslexia just means you get the letters the wrong way around.
I've known people who are dyslexic who have written letters and numbers backwards. It's not something I've ever done. It's not something that has ever been a problem for me when I'm handwriting. I can generally handwrite relatively quickly, but the quicker I get, the more illegible it gets. And obviously the spelling's not great, but no, it's definitely something that some people with dyslexia do. And I think it's probably not even conscious that they're doing it, but it's not something that I've ever done. So it's definitely not something that all people with dyslexia do.
Myth number 2. Dyslexic people just need to try harder.
I'd be a little bit controversial and say that for me, growing up, I did have to put extra work in. When you're dyslexic, you have to develop mechanisms for dealing with the things that you're not quite as good at, or the things that your brain doesn't quite work in the same way around. So I know that my step-granddad is dyslexic, and the way he learnt to read was he learnt to recognise the patterns in letters and words. So when he sees a word, he doesn't see a word, he doesn't see letters, he just sees a shape. And he recognises that as what that means and goes along. So I do think you can't just say, they're not trying hard enough. They're lazy, this, that and the other. That gets thrown around a lot. Got thrown around with my brother's dyslexic as well. And he got a lot of that, you're not trying hard enough. Because it can be really discouraging when you're dyslexic. You can want to give up, especially when you're young and you're not making progress and everyone around you is making progress. It can be really disheartening. And that's when people can start giving up. And that's when people can start pointing fingers and saying, you're being lazy, you're not trying hard enough. I think there needs to be the understanding that people with dyslexia actually need to try harder than most others. And that's just to overcome the disadvantage and get to an equal level. And then they have to try even harder if they want to progress above that. So, you do need to try, you do need to apply yourself and dedicate yourself to it, but you should also have understanding and support around you, and you should be able to take a break, you should be able to make mistakes and take your time over it.
Myth number 3. Dyslexic people can't be successful.
I think that is definitely not true. Loads of people with dyslexia are successful. I think that in certain situations, it might be more difficult to be successful. If you've got bad dyslexia and your ambition is to be a writer, you might have to put in more work than your peers, and that might be more difficult for you, but there's nothing stopping you from achieving, especially because what I've found is For me, there are sort of just mechanisms I can put in place that really help me improve. And whether that be typing instead of handwriting, or if that's listening to things read out, because, we've all got computers these days. You don't have to read things. You can listen to it read out to you and make notes while it's reading it to you and things like that. So if you have things in place, you can be successful. And if you dedicate yourself to it, the same as anyone has to. If you want to be a sportsman, but you've been in a car accident and lost your leg, you can still be a sportsman. And I'm not saying that's exactly the same, but there are parodies to be drawn there. You just have to try a bit harder. But that's what I'd say to that.
Myth number 4, dyslexia is just a visual problem.
I'd say an element of dyslexia is visual. I know people who are dyslexic, they look at a page of letters, it jumbles around, they miss lines, and I miss lines quite a lot when I'm reading. But it's definitely not just a visual problem. It affects the way you process information, it affects the way you analyse things. I think dyslexia can also be coupled with other things as well, like, anxiety and things around time management and wanting to get things right. Or maybe that's not quite dyslexia, but it can be a symptom that comes in with dyslexia. So there is a big visual part, but I wouldn't say it's entirely visual.
How do you feel the media represents someone with dyslexia?
I don't see an awful lot in the media about dyslexia. I think that it's something that people are talking about more and more. My mum's dyslexic. When she was growing up, people had no idea what dyslexia was. But nowadays, when you say dyslexia, everyone knows what it is, roughly. So obviously, it's, people are talking about it more. It must be in the media more. I don't think we hear, big headline articles about people with dyslexia. You see probably sort of columns about it in like local newspapers about how schools are dealing with it and how universities are dealing with it. But I don't think it's something that's in the media's eye a lot. And maybe it should be a bit more.
Is there anything else you would like to say, or anything you would like anyone to know about dyslexia?
One of the other stereotypes is that, dyslexic people are stupid. What I'd just like to say is that some dyslexic people are stupid. Some non-neurodivergent people aren't, not as smart as others. Some dyslexic people are some of the smartest people in the world. So it really... It can be a disadvantage, but it really isn't something that you should judge people on. You shouldn't make sort of prejudgments about how capable someone's going to be if they've told you they've got dyslexia. You shouldn't sort of be exasperated if they say, sorry about the spelling mistakes, sorry about the grammar mistakes, because ultimately those things are quite small and they don't really matter. So yeah, just be understanding. Don't jump to prejudge people. And dyslexia is pretty common. I think more people have it than you'd realise.